In this video, we will go over how to conduct a source analysis. In this video, we will discuss the TOMACPRU method as a way for gathering all the information you need about a source so that you can create an analysis. Here on this slide, we see three sources. When we are doing a source analysis, what we are really aiming for is to get its ideological perspective of each source and the whole range from these sources. For the assignment, you'll be writing a 4-paragraph composition. The first 3 paragraphs will be interpretations. As you can see on the right, we have a source 1, which is a political cartoon, source 2, which is a photo, and source 3, which is a text. For a source analysis assignment based on these 3 sources, you would write an interpretation of the cartoon, an interpretation of the quote, and an interpretation of the photo. By interpretation, we mean that you would restate the message of each of those sources in your own words, and you will go on further to make connections. And by connections, we mean connections to ideology. You would state for each source one of the principles that applies to the source. These principles, you'll remember, are from collectivism and individualism. Lastly, you'll do your best to connect the message of the source to an ideology, whether it be classical liberalism, socialism, communism, fascism, modern liberalism, or even contemporary liberalism. Lastly, you will write a relationships paragraph. These relationships are the relationships between the positions. These are ideological positions of each of those sources as seen on a spectrum. You will recall there is a political spectrum, an economic spectrum, and a social spectrum. Each of these sources will have a position on at least one of those spectrums. You will finish then by comparing sources that have common positions, different positions, and even identify a common thread for all 3 sources. When you go to do the first part, the interpretation, one of the things is that you will look for principles. So you will look at the message of the source and what was intended. And you will identify any principles that might apply to that particular source. Note that a source will likely have one principle, but it may also have a couple of other principles that are closely related. Next, when you're interpreting the source and you're making a connection, you'll want to connect it to an ideology. Here we see the evolution of liberalism, moving out of the Enlightenment, out of the past of feudalism into classical liberalism, which occurred during the Industrial Revolution, primarily in Great Britain and in Europe. From there, into the 1800s up until World War I, we see responses to this classical liberalism, much in the way of grassroots movements and in socialism. We also see, which began shortly after World War I and carried on through World War II, the ideologies of communism and fascism, both being rejections of liberalism in terms of its principles and its tenets. From there, liberalism evolved into modern liberalism. Communism under the Soviet Union and the modern liberalism championed by the United States created a series of superpowers wanting to impose their ideologies as the right and correct one. We've gone now from Europe to North America to a global experience of this liberalism. From there, we come out of this modern liberalism, which runs starting after World War II into about the late 1980s, into contemporary liberalism. Here and during this time, challenges to current ideas are made available. dealing with citizenship and globalization and positive freedoms become the focus of this new contemporary liberalism. And that is the liberalism we deal with and are exposed to today. What is the importance of knowing these timelines and these locations is they will give you clues as to where this source belongs to. For example, if the source is dealing with abuses that occurred during classical liberalism during the Industrial Revolution, it would likely fit a classical liberalism or maybe even a socialist ideology. If the source deals with the rejection of liberalism and deals with eradication of particular liberalist ideas or freedoms, then it might be fascism or even communism. If we see reference to the superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union, and them engaging in war and economic sanctions against smaller countries in order to impose their ideology, it would likely be from the modern liberalism. If the source deals with individual rights and positive freedoms and activism and changing history and revising how we see things, it would likely fit in within the period of contemporary liberalism. Here we see the acronym TOMACPRU. It's just a really good acronym for fleshing out everything we need about a source. You have previously classified source. You identified the type of the source. Was it a political cartoon, a poster, a photo, a quote? You identified the origin. Was it primary, created in the moment, or was it secondary, a comment on the issue or events or movements or school of thought? You identified the motives, another way of saying the beliefs and values of the author, or maybe even the beliefs and values of the subject of the source. You also went on to discuss the audience. That's really the time and place in which this source is describing. All of those things provide a context. Next, you went on to evaluating sources. You looked at their reliability. You looked at whether they came from authentic sources or if they were biased or contained any misleading information. You also looked at the source's usefulness. Would the source be able to provide enough evidence to back the message? From there, you went on to interpreting. And that's part of what we're doing today, in that you created a summary in your own words of the message of the source. You also attached an ideological principle, and you would have connected it to an ideology, something that we're going to practice a bit more here. But lastly, the piece that we're ending today is the P, which is perspective. This is where we're going to make those connections to ideologies and where we're going to make some of those comparisons. Here we see source 1. If we were to walk through the TOMACPRU part, it will give us a really good set of brainstorming and ideas which we can include in our source assignment. Here, the type is a political cartoon. Its origin is secondary. It's a commentary on the Nazi Germany regime and its perspective. Motives. We have the creator, who's a cartoonist, and we can see that he or she is trying to expose the attacks on rights and freedoms which the Nazi regime carried out on specific peoples. As well, the subject of the cartoon shows the Nazi regime's belief that only certain people should have rights, and that an adherence to collective norms was central. The audience would be considered the general public. This cartoonist and its cartoon is probably occurring in more modern times, and it is trying to, in exposing those attacks on rights and freedoms, to make sure that we don't allow them to happen again. Next, we'll move on to interpreting. We're going to put the cartoon in our own words. Here we can say that Hitler is claiming that he's restored honor and freedom. The irony of the cartoon is that below him in prison, there are people that definitely do not have that honor and freedom. Each cell in the prison box shows some right or freedom labeled underneath the bars that was taken away from each of those people or each of those groups of people. Lastly, we go on to analyzing, and this is where we make those connections. Here we would say that the cartoon is definitely dealing with individual rights and freedoms. The creator is advocating for them, and the subject, however, is advocating against them or limiting them to a particular group of people. In terms of ideology, the subject of the cartoon definitely deals with fascism. The creator's perspective on fascism is that it is being hypocritical in claiming individual rights and freedoms when it is done, made every effort to remove them from certain people. So you will do that for each of those sources, source 1, 2, and 3. Then for your fourth paragraph, you're going to write about relationships. When we're talking about relationships, we're really talking about positions on spectrums. Typically, when we use the visual, that little pin represents a position for each of those sources. When we identify the positions on a spectrum, then we will answer the following 3 questions. What 2 sources are similar? What 2 sources are different? And what do all 3 sources have in common? Here are the spectrums. If you do not recall them, we have the social spectrum, which deals with social change and people's attitudes or views towards how quickly things should change or in which direction, if the changes should be dropped or removed altogether. We have the political spectrum, which deals with where does the decision-making and power lie in society. It was within a handful or a group of people exercising power and control over others and decision-making, or is it more spread out with individuals having more control and authority over their own daily lives? Then we have the economic spectrum, which deals with access to and the distribution of resources in a world where those resources are scarce. Understanding those spectrums is a key piece. We will find for each source a position on a spectrum. Let's take a look at source number 1. Here's the political cartoon. Certainly, the position of the subject of the source, which is Nazi Germany and its regime, that regime would have had a reactionary position on the social spectrum. It wanted to return to a former empire with a single nation and superior race, and is willing to do so quickly with acts of violence, indoctrination, and even executions. Note that the position, however, of the cartoonist would be different. We can't be exactly sure, but we know that he is not reactionary, as he is poking fun at the hypocrisy. He likely would be something in the range more of a progressive position. Here, in source 2, we have a quote from Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau. Here he talks about Canada and its various communities based on culture and language, and the protection of those things through the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. This quote would have a more progressive position in that change comes about through legislation and democracy, and is moving in a positive way to protect those individual rights and freedoms. Lastly, we have source number 3, which is the March on Washington, carried out by Martin Luther King and his supporters. Here, the march is to protest Jim Crow and other segregation laws. The intent of the parade is to draw attention to it to bring about change. This source could be seen as progressive, maybe even highly so. There is no outcry or push for violence, but rather that through debate and dialogue and awareness that change may eventually come about and happen. Lastly, when we have all three sources and we put them on the one chosen spectrum, we then answer our questions: what two sources are similar? In this case, the quote from Trudeau, source 2, and the March on Washington photo from source 3 are very similar in that they are both progressive, and they both believe in creating individual rights and freedoms, one through legal measures and one through activism and awareness. What two sources are different? Well, certainly source 3 and source 1 are different in that the message of the photo is that this individual rights and freedoms can be created through promoting this awareness. The subject of the first source, being the Nazi regime and its restrictions on rights and freedoms, would be considered an exact opposite, is that violence was called for and it was actually an eradication of rights and freedoms for those that did not belong. Note that the cartoonist perspective, however, and position would likely be more leaning towards the progressive end of the spectrum. What do all three sources have in common? Well, they all certainly deal with social change, but they also have an emphasis on supporting and protecting individual rights and freedoms as an essential part of the common good for both the collective and the individual. So there you have it. That is our discussion of source analysis. I hope that you're able to use the TOMACPRU method as a way of flushing out ideas so that you can write your 4-paragraph source analysis assignment.